All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started with today's community call. Thank you to everyone who's here for joining. I'll go ahead and start out the call as usual with a couple quick announcements. Then we will transition into the main topic of reconnecting science with the general public. So, as always, it's been a busy week at DeSci Labs. Um, the development team has been working on some of the back-end structure for citations in Web3 and thinking about how we can use Ethereum and IPFS and just general blockchain and Web3 technologies to make a more efficient method for citations. For those of you who may not have seen Balaji, Balaji Srinivasan actually released a challenge about a week or two ago, talking about how the very first step in decentralized science is the ability to cite one paper on chain from another. We like to take that a step further and think about how we can cite entire research objects and even individual components within them on chain. So excited to see more information on that coming out soon. We released our next round of alpha testers. So I see one of them on the call at the moment. Hey, Ellie. And we are excited to continue to onboard people as we release more and more features. Thank you to everyone who has been contributing bug requests and bug reports and feature requests thus far. They've been very helpful, and the dev team has been responding to them as they come in. So hopefully within 2 weeks of actually reporting a bug, you should see a fix. We should have last week, last week, Mateo gave a call all about his node. Very possible that next week we have another call with Ian to talk about some of the work that he's done on the general index through the context of a DeSci node. And then I think beyond that, we will be having a coffee house right after this. So that's an extra hour to just sit down, hang out with the team and with anyone who's on the call. We will be having onboarding office hours, product support office hours tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, and that is 7 p.m. Central. We will be having onboarding office hours at 9 a.m. Eastern, which is 3 p.m. Central European time. And then we should be hosting our first journal club this Friday at 11 a.m. All around the work that Carla has done on her master's thesis, which she just submitted. Woo! Yay, Carla. So those are a couple quick updates from the DeSci Labs team. Thank you, John, for the amazing Science Commons initiative thread all around the happenings in DeSci. If you want more information on everything that's been done last week, you can go check it out there, and maybe John can post a quick thread. So with that, I think we're pretty much good for announcements for the day. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to add? So I'm going to go ahead and assume that silence is golden here, and we don't have anything else to add. We can go ahead and get started with the part of the conversation today. Apologies if there's some background noise. I'm in a public space today and folks may be talking. But John, I think you had some great ideas to kick us off around conversations about how to reconnect science with the general public, which is our topic for the day. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were talking before we started recording here, just the difference between communication and engagement when it comes to science. So both are incredibly important. Science communication is an entire field, like an industry. You can go get a job in SciComms. Great example there is Bill Nye, although I don't think he went and got that job. He just kind of did his thing. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, another big guy. With science engagement, though, it's a little different. I don't think it's exactly an industry. And to stress the difference between the two, I'll use an example of a community I work with. The community is called BOINC. It stands for the Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Networked Computing. It's a giant distributed computing network where basically people offer computer cycles to do science. A researcher has some data that needs processing, and the general public can participate in that processing with their computer at home. And that project was started in 1999 out of SETI at home, which I imagine a lot of people here have run. And some people probably have even used BOINC because BOINC is fairly large. And when they started that project, they got NSF funding. And the whole reason it succeeded in getting the funding, launching, and getting popular, again, before there was even YouTube, this got popular, like wildly popular, was because the idea behind it was simply we want to get the public engaged in science and participating in the process. It's not we want to tell them what SETI does and how SETI works, but we want them to actually feel involved and have a stake, so to speak. And that might come back up later because we're working with blockchains and it's a very similar concept. But we want them to have a stake in the research itself. And it was wildly successful. So when you get people engaged, you're making them part of the process so they feel connected to the outcomes. It's not me understanding something and telling you about it in a sort of diluted language that you will understand instead of just all the jargon of my field. It's you actually reciprocating that. And so I might explain it to you, but then you come in and participate in it. And then from that, you might end up asking more questions and learning even more. And eventually, this BOINC project, which continues today, has gotten people engaged in science when they were young kids to the point that they end up participating in the science industry as adults. Like their whole career path is rooted in participating in a science project from youth. So it's very interesting to see how maybe DeSci can expand this engagement aspect, engagement and participation, when it might bring in financial concepts or game theory. And I'll just layer on top of this really quick, and then I'd love for a conversation to come out of it. But a cryptocurrency that was built on top of BOINC is called Gridcoin, and it did just that. It took a successful engagement project and added monetary incentive to it separately. So the two are separate projects, but Gridcoin built on top of BOINC in the stack. And what we've found is it does get people more engaged. We get to play with by manipulating the economics behind Gridcoin, we get to manipulate the science that the people in BOINC participate with. So there's a lot of different, like that idea, just like that realization right there can expand into thousands of different tentacles, I guess. So it's an interesting potential that I think DeSci has to not just communicate science to people, but to get them participating in the system. And the ultimate outcome, again, is that the person will feel connected to the result of the science. So COVID-19 came up before the recording as well. If someone participates in creating a vaccine, they're much more likely to trust the outcome of that vaccine instead of just being told by someone that's like they're not even connected to, they don't even know this person, they're just told to trust, like Fauci, for example. Instead of just being told to trust Fauci, it's like, no, trust what you did. You helped. Go ahead, take the vaccine. Right? So that's basically it. So hopefully people have some thoughts to chime in here, whether they agree with it or think SciComms is the only way or think DeSci has no connection to any of this nonsense.
I appreciate the introduction there, especially what Gitcoin's doing and the computational side of things. Something that's been on my mind recently has been around data. I was chatting with a friend who just finished up a PhD, and he told me that for one of the projects they paid like tens of thousands of dollars for like a year's worth of car data. They were doing some sort of engineering and figuring out a city layout. I don't know, stuff like that. But I wonder what types of does anyone know if there are projects that are doing this where they're kind of looking at collecting individual data from just everyday things, whether that's putting an accelerometer in your car and then just that data getting fed to some database. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to participate in that way, right? To say, hey, my data is being used. I'm donating it or I'm selling it, maybe in some sort of protocol, in order to be used to further some science aspect.
Yeah, Boink actually does that. And I think there's a lot of DeSci projects coming up that are going to do that as well. But Boink has been doing that for a very long time. There's a project called Radioactive at Home, perhaps. Something with radioactivity in the name. And what they do is they sell Geiger counters, like very custom Geiger counters, to people around the world who set them up. And they basically aggregate the data to a giant database that is open for use from the public. There's another one called Ithena, which traces the internet. So it hooks into your computer. I don't know technically how this functions, but it then traces packets through that big series of pipes. And it's a very interesting new project. And there's a lot of people who want to do, we call them sensor projects, where you do the accelerometer, you do air pollution would be a very fun one. Humidity would be interesting with climate change and like temperature, stuff like that. The technology already exists for this to happen, and I think monetizing it is super valuable. And again, I think there's a lot more projects that are going to come up with DLT that is just going to enable it even further.
There is actually a project called Planet Watch for air quality monitoring, where you have to buy the device for monitoring, and then you get to sell your data for your city, your country, or the place where you live, actually back to the company. Oh, you added the link. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
That's so cool. So is the data free? Like once it comes up or once you send it back to the company, did they publish it or did they just get to do what they want with it?
At the moment, they do not have enough devices since they just recently started working. So they first have to sell a certain amount of devices and for people to actually
it may just be my connection, but Isabel, I think you're cutting out a little bit.
No, she was clear on my end.
Oh, okay. Maybe. Sorry, that is my connection then.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, at the moment they are still building a network before actually giving out data. But their ultimate goal is actually to get data available to everyone so that people can see which cities are more polluted than others and what can be done about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking at it. This is a crypto. This is looks like it's built on algo.
That is fantastic. And actually I was on a call the other day with Flow Science with two folks who talked about a lot of similar concepts around this. Actually, one was SciDAO, who is trying to use Web3 and DAO funding mechanisms to try and garner support and interest for underfunded fields of science. Their specific niche is a lot of psychedelics. And then there was another group called Republic, who was thinking about a lot of the back-end data structures around how to enable people to own their data for some of these, I guess, citizen science style data reporting projects. So definitely some cool ones right there. Flow Science, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think thanks for the invite. I think there's so many applications where we're generating personal data in our lives, right? And yeah, I think we can just rattle off a ton where this concept is applicable. But yeah, Keith from Republic DAO, was really brought that perspective. I think outside of DeSci, and I think my key takeaway from that thing I thought was most interesting was participant data. Getting owning the data that somebody is giving to a study, or at least being able to see how that data is being used and things like that. If it was being coded, right, they would be the only ones with access to decode it, right? So I think things like that that was the most interesting aspect of that conversation.
I'm curious, as we have so many people here who are familiar with like I guess they're all citizen science projects in a way. I'm wondering what people's thoughts are on why we're sort of in a situation where we even need to have this discussion in the first place. Right? Where it's like, why is academia so separated from the public when I'm assuming it's obvious that you need to have the public involved in science in some way, or they're just going to reject the outcomes of the system.
I mean, one of my initial thoughts there is just the exponential growth of academia in the past half a century. The fact that fields and specialties in academia have become so wildly specialized that it's very difficult for any one member of the general public who may not necessarily understand a lot of the technical jargon behind an individual field to contribute in a meaningful way. I mean, it's very difficult for anyone to keep up to pace with even just one specific field of science. But I mean, that being said, I think that's been a problem for centuries. I would say that whenever electricity first came out, it was essentially voodoo magic to anyone who wasn't actively a researcher in the field. And even to a certain extent, I would say today, electricity is still voodoo magic to a large percentage of the population. So a part of it is that fragmentation. That's one potential reasoning I'd offer. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts here.
I think it's a good one. Like I mean, if I were to add anything to McBags, if you want to go for it.
Thanks. I just want to say, no, I think you're right. Part of it is that type of specialization, and I wonder if part of that could be bridged in a way if we get data that could be used in so many different ways, right? If I started a program where everyone put an accelerometer in their car, right? I could explain to people, say, hey, look, we're gonna make this data available, and people are gonna use it for machine learning to look at patterns, or they're gonna look at engineering to design better roads, and I don't know, stuff like that. I guess I also and I don't know if this is getting away from the immediate topic, but I think it would be fun to see, and obviously all of us here like science, right? So we want people to understand science more as well, and when they're participating in it, actually understand it more. I'd love to be able to see, I think like my goal, I would love to see people do research, not just, I think it's great to have them contribute to it, to say, hey, my computer is working on holding these proteins, or this data I'm collecting, this device I put in my car is going to be used in this research. But I think the closer we can get to people saying, hey, what if I changed this, what would happen? I think that would be phenomenal if the general public did that.
Yeah, I think that actually highlights another reason why this might have become a problem, because I completely agree that would be fantastic. But for basically all of science's history that I'm aware of, the specialization required in regards to tooling has really limited who could do the research. You had to invest an insane amount of money for a lot of this research. Think of a giant telescope if you want to do space. Look at this space. Look at space. Put simply, you had to work with a university. You'd work with a giant institution, and as maybe some of these tools move more towards being data dependent, or the research becomes data dependent, the tool that collects the data might be one completely separate industry from the people who actually do the research. 'Cause if you make it open data, anyone can grab the data set and play with it and do something really neat. Like with proteins, what was the thing? AlphaFold just discovered, identified every protein we've ever known at some level. So now what are people going to do with that data? That would be really fun to see.
I agree. I think I'm interested in looking at this the radiation study you mentioned, right? If that data is widely available, I can run a few Python scripts on it to look for correlations between things and stuff like that. We definitely are getting at a point where in certain ways tooling is becoming more widely available. I remember when I was a teacher in the classroom, there are so many things that your phone measures and you can run experiments off of. And so I don't know if it's just getting awareness, letting people know you could run experiments with the data from your phone.
I mean, John, I think it comes back to one of the earlier points that you mentioned. It's the gamification of it. And that was one of the things that Gridcoin kind of helped do for the Berkeley Open Infrastructure Network Compute. I keep trying to remember what BOINC stands for. But the idea that it turns what could be seen as an exercise, as a piece of work to do, into something that's fun, something that's gamified, something that is, I guess, yeah, pretty much gamified.
Yeah, there's another aspect to it too. On top of just making it fun, not everyone likes to do fun stuff. But at the end of the day, I would be confident in saying that almost everyone likes to make money. So if we make a system where it's like, okay, you're greedy, that's fine. In order to make your money, I'm trying not to swear. In order to make your money, you're going to have to do science. That's kind of the concept behind the Gridcoin system. It's like, yeah, you can make money. That's fine. But in order to become rich, you're going to have to do science. And while you become rich by producing science, you're actually rising all boats. You're rising the tide that lifts all boats. So that sounds much better than a system we currently live in, where it's like, all right, you want to make money. What you're going to have to do is borrow money, fractionally reserve it, and try to loan it out and Ponzi that up before it all collapses. And hopefully you get out before it collapses. Right? So it's about gamifying, but also capitalizing on the fact that everyone's greedy and we're never going to get rid of that emotion.
And I mean, as you think of the idea of, I can't believe I'm blanking on the concept right now, of customer acquisition cost, excuse me. As you think of the idea of customer acquisition costs in VC or a startup, it's going to cost a little bit of money to get someone on board. The idea may not necessarily always be to have them be the foremost expert on the platform, but it's just a place for them to get started. It's just enough to get them involved in science. It's a foot in the door. And I think that a similar concept can really be useful here. So I agree with your take around monetization. I also think that the fun part is something that should play into it. If we can make
Absolutely.
something more enjoyable and someone gets paid for it, that's fantastic.
For
So
an example,
yeah, go for it.
well, I was just going to bring up Foldit, or like there's a bunch of games that have turned science and citizen science into actual literal games. So you're playing a game, you don't even know you're doing science, and the next thing you know, you folded a protein to the lowest energy state or something like that. It's great.
It is. One of the things that comes to mind, I know Google has released a couple different things around surveys and forums for scientists, where you can essentially put a form out there. Anyone who's actively on the Google platform can complete the form, make like 50 cents, a dollar. It's nothing crazy, but given the fact that each one of these forms takes a very short period of time, you can actually possibly make a decent living off of that. That being said, I don't know many people who actually do that. So I think monetization should be a part of it, and in the world of Web3, it's going to be. But I think that the gamified aspect is important as well. It needs to be something that's fun, that doesn't feel like a job for people to actually do it, because most people will have a full-time job and can't dedicate their entire life to doing science. It's as much of a hobby thing in a citizen science perspective as anything else.
Yeah, but if you think of it as like a gig, so if you have these devices like this accelerometer in your car or this pollution detector, air purifier, what have you,
Yeah.
it's you just throw it on and you're participating, you're engaging, and you're making sort of a trickle income to supplement your job. So you've gone through a couple steps to get your foot in the door, as you're putting it, and then you're also there's the potential to dive deeper if you want to maybe maximize income. But the whole reason you're starting it is because there's a supplemental income. You're gaining a little bit for doing it, because at the end of the day, I truly believe you get what you incentivize as a society. If you incentivize science and participation, that's what you're going to get. If you incentivize financialization and banking, that's what you're going to get.
One great example in Web3 of this for me is actually the Helium Network. So it was the first time that I had ever heard of a real use case of crypto outside of just financial, outside of trading Bitcoin as a means of exchanging money. And it was mind blowing to me whenever I first saw this platform. So, to anyone who doesn't know, Helium is a decentralized wireless infrastructure protocol. It's something where you can go and put a lo-fi wireless router in your home and help to transfer data between different routers in a larger network. I think at this point they have somewhere around 600,000 hotspots enabled around the world and form a cohesive wireless network, especially in major metropolitan areas, that can be used for small amounts of data. It's nothing major, it's IoT devices, things that are 1 meg max. But through that, the next thing that I'm actually thinking about and want to try doing is setting up sensors on this network that actually transfer data back and forth. So I have one of these routers enabled in my living room, and I make money just passively by letting it sit there. But if I were to put different sensors, let's say around my neighborhood for pollution, not only can I make money off of selling that pollution data, I can also make money off of my router transferring the information across the larger network, which is an interesting concept that as a user of Web3 protocols, you can potentially monetize the entire stack. It's not just the data itself, it's the infrastructure that the data is running on. So just another point to add on to that. And I think that that plays in really well with a lot of what John's talked about with Boink.
All of it enabled by blockchain. It is. So one thing I struggle with this topic is my biases. I'm very biased against academia. I think it's a closed off institution that rejects more people than it accepts, and it creates great things, but also hurts a lot of people in many ways. But at the same time, I think it's important for people like me to recognize that it's a two-way street. So the public, the separation between academia and the public is, you can partly blame the public, because for a long time, people look at the outcomes of science and think to themselves, someone else will do it, or like they put almost too much trust in these centralized institutions that control the tools and the funding and everything, to the point where they no longer want to participate, or that's it. They just no longer want to participate. They'll let other people do it, and to the detriment of other people who don't trust like that vaccine that will come out of a university. I'm wondering if anyone else has any thoughts on that sort of angle on the divide between public and science.
I mean, John, one thing that immediately comes up to me with respect to that is the replication crisis, actually. So part of it is saying, I don't have to be involved. There's an expert who's going to do it. This is past my pay grade. And another part of it is just how much money it costs to get a PhD, especially in the US. You're going to have to float pretty much $1 million in education to get to the point where you are specialized enough in one field to have a useful perspective. Useful is the wrong word, but to have a refined perspective over the course of a decade. I think another aspect with respect to that is, excuse me, kind of the fact that the replication crisis takes people who have already been less than engaged and continues to make them more and more skeptical. So you see the study that recently came out around Alzheimer's, and the fact that one of the base papers in Alzheimer research that has been the foundation of the field for the better part of 2 decades was just recently proven false. I mean, as someone who hasn't necessarily been deeply ingrained in Alzheimer's research for 20 years, I'm just assuming that people are doing things the way that they should be done. I have an inherent trust of academia because I was always grown up in a household that really valued science. So seeing something like that as a science enthusiast hurts my trust of the larger system. It makes it so much harder for the general public to reconnect with science. So it kind of goes back to, and I think that this is one of the more powerful aspects of nodes, kind of comes back to allowing people to see, enabling transparency, and making sure that if they want to go into a piece of research, that they have the ability to look, that they can go play around with the code and the data, that everything is open in a way where other scientists in a specific field can actually go in and verify information, and that novelty is no longer the basis of quality science, rather it's replicability and reproducibility. I would say that the Alzheimer's study is a huge part in reconnecting science with the general public.
Yeah, I love that, and that's one of the big arguments that anti-vaxxers use is, well, I don't put something in my body that I don't know what it's made of. It's like, yes, you can go figure out what's in it, but if it's in a transparent system like you're describing, that argument completely dissolves, because it's just, you can actually go into the tree of knowledge and find out the base paper is incorrect if you want to do that. Like just came out with Alzheimer's, and it also goes back to what McBaggs was talking about. Um, it it lets people take that knowledge and do research with it, and it makes me think of Joggle, just one giant lab, which is like open source science where people can do their own wet labs, as I understand it. And it's just a really interesting way to get the public to find a paper and then give them access to some of the tools, and then have them come up with a novel outcome from it. I see nothing bad with that. And it seems like that model, which is completely separate from Web3, could benefit from some of the tools that come out of Web3 development. And it would just be, I can't wait to see that merger happen. That merger and stuff like biohacking and all these citizen actual like physical research merging with some of the tools that we're working on.
Absolutely. After Carla posted that link to Joggle on, I think it was the general channel, I read into it. What an interesting project. I think that they did a lot of work around micro grant funding, which is a really neat concept, especially as you think about trying to get people more involved in science. If it's possible for me to come into a wet lab with, let's say, or this kind of a protocol with a bachelor's degree worth of experience and just get $1,000 to play around with things for a month or two, that is a massive step towards enabling people to actually get involved and interested in science, who may or may not have decided to pursue a doctorate after a bachelor's degree. I mean, that is a huge commitment, to say the least. So
Yeah,
yeah, I love the joggle, I guess, business model and mindset.
and it's all towards fixing the problem that you were just talking about, which is lack of trust. If you don't have trust in the system, you're not going to trust the outcomes. So it's, how do you repair the trust that's been broken between you have a essentially academic background and you're saying now you don't even trust it because a root paper is disproven. So imagine the general public's trust with this entire system. There's so many different ways to repair it. There's the DeSci Nodes, this whole project that DeSci Labs and the DeSci Foundation is working on. You've got Joggle, you've got Boink, you've got the Planet Watch, you've got all these different avenues. So at this point, it's just like, well, shit, after this talk, I feel like the problem is solved. We can move on now.
Yep, we fixed science. Congrats, John.
Give it 5 years, everything will be peachy clean, right?
No, I mean, another one that's been brought up a lot recently that I find rather interesting is the concept of reconnecting art and science.
Ooh, that's a good
And
one.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, the medium is the message. And I know that that's a cliche phrase, and I apologize, but there is a lot of truth behind that. Where if it's something that's engaging, that's fun, that's beautiful, that relates back to the underlying science behind it, you have a much higher chance of getting someone to engage, to look at it, and to think about it. And John, I don't know if you've ever read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That's one of my favorites of all time. One of the things that they really talk about in that particular book is the division between science and art, and how, in reality, science and art are very similar concepts. It's about creativity, exploration, and discovery. But generally, whenever someone thinks of science, they think of equations and calculators and kind of more technological issues. So trying to bridge the gap between science and art is another really interesting way to reconnect science and the general public. I
Yeah,
think
I've
one
never.
of the thing yeah, sorry. I think one other thing, one of the things that we'd like to enable at DeSci Labs is a metaverse library, is a digital library of Alexandria, complete with custom artisan works of some of the most beautiful scientific papers out there. And I've seen quite a few different people in the DeSci space who work at the intersection of art and science, and it's exciting to think about what that kind of an aesthetic library could do for science as a general construct.
Yeah, it would be very interesting, and I think it is like to sort of expand the idea a little bit, because we've talked about the sort of the rigid structure of science, the spreadsheets and the calculators, and now we're bringing in the art aspect. We've talked about the greedy aspect. You just want to make money, and all of this seems to be connected to just making science relatable to different types of people. So if you can think of a survivalist or something, I just watched a TV show that's like it just drops people off in the wilderness. They have to survive for a week. Uh, if you can connect science to them, or rather let them participate in science and use science to their own end, I think you rebuild the trust. Because if I have done research on like which fishing net is the best, and I'm sure there's better topics for a survivalist here, but uh, so if I do that research, I'm going to understand the process a little bit, and by understanding the process, I might more readily accept and trust science that comes out from a different field. And again, I'll tie it back to a vaccine. I have no idea how vaccines are built, but I understand the scientific process based on what I've done with it. So if I can look at the process used to come up with that vaccine, I'll be able to, at some level at least, verify that it was a similar process to what I did. And if it is, I can trust it more because I understand it a little better. It's not that someone took the science and gave it to me. It's that I had access to the tools of science and the knowledge that those tools bring. And so I'm now part of the system again. And it's same with art. If I'm an artist, I can use like these data sets. I forget who was doing like visualizations of
I think
that
it was
really cool.
Mateo. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
Mateo.
If I can make cool visualizations with the science, all right, cool. Here's the process between how that data came up. I'll now understand biological sciences a little better and appreciate and trust the outcome. It's a very powerful thing, giving more people access to participate and engage in the scientific process, regardless of what their background is.
So, John, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that one. So, for those of y'all who don't know, I come from the American South, which tends to be somewhat of a hotbed for misinformation, unfortunately. Um, a lot of people down in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Central Florida don't necessarily trust some of the results that come out of academia. But the one group that they do trust almost universally is agricultural science from state colleges. That's one where you can almost always make headway because for someone who lives out on a farm and spends pretty much all day out in the field tilling crops and selecting seeds, things along those lines, they will religiously read a lot of the reports that come out from agricultural colleges. And it does build a certain amount of trust in science. Now, they may not necessarily trust everything that comes out of the vaccine, but they do have some form of interaction because it directly relates with their ability to make money. So it's interesting that you brought that up, especially in the context of art. But I do think that some of that relation is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you hit another huge point. It's that they're coming out of community colleges. They're coming out of research institutions close to home. They might know someone that goes to that university or that college instead of like having to trust this big Ivy League from Boston. Is like, okay, like they clearly have a lot of money, and there's probably this is maybe their perspective. They have a lot of money. They're corrupt. They're so far away. I have no connection to that institution. But this community college, my cousin goes there. And so why wouldn't I trust what they come out with?
John, this kind of ties into a lot of what you've been saying for the past few minutes, ties into a concept that I've been thinking about for a little while, which is capital allocation and valuation preferences in the general public. So I was on a conference with Eugene from Research Hub not too long ago. And he started talking about, it was a Research Hub conference with Eugene from SCURF, excuse me. And he was really talking about how he values capital and the fact that ideas, the fact that the ability to do good is worth more than money to him. And it sparked a thought around different kinds of capital in the world. The fact that there is social capital, there's cultural capital, there's intellectual capital, material capital, natural capital, financial capital, so many other ways that we can value resources. And so many of those resources are not necessarily quantifiable, which makes it kind of different. But for a lot of people who are in the general public, they tend to value social capital because that's what their life has been built on. I trust the results coming out of this college because I know that my cousin goes there and I trust my cousin. I have an existing relationship with that particular university. So, thinking about academia, the primary form of currency in academia is citations, innovations, intellectual capital, basically. The primary form of currency in the general public is either going to be cultural or social capital. The customs and norms that I grew up with, that I'm familiar with, and the relationships and networks that I built over the course of my life, friends and family. So trying to, and this is one of the issues that I have with with SciComms, even though I do think that SciComms is a critically important part of the scientific stack, and I think we do need to take complex concepts and make them a little bit more understandable for everyone else. Complex intellectual wording that's been simplified is not the same thing as being able to interact with or trust science. It's not a direct conversion to social capital, which is essentially the language that the general public speaks. If you can think of capital allocation and valuation preferences as a specific form of language. So I don't know if that sparks anything for you, but I'd be interested to hear your take there.
No, I like it. I'm just curious how do we use that? How do we use that realization to bring the public into the scientific system? I think there's something there. I just can't think of it off the top of my head.
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying around the medium being the message and some of the interactive parts of science. The realization that ultimately, if we can use science and knowledge to help people form stronger connections between each other, if we can have science serve as the foundation of social capital, or at least create an efficient conversion between them, there's power behind that. Imagine, for example, this is just a hypothetical. Imagine a video game built on top of DeSci Nodes, where every single prominent, incredible node could be an object in the game. And in order to actually unlock that object, you had to go learn about the innovation behind that specific piece of paper. But ultimately, the video game is about bringing people together, is about forming connections between individuals. This is just one example, but I think it's one that could be worth mentioning. This is a problem that people have been trying to solve for decades and centuries. So despite your earlier comment, I don't think we're going to solve it in a 1-hour call, but McBags, I see you just came
Buzzkill.
off mute.
I'm wondering too if we're thinking about, like, I was thinking of what you said about people having stake because it affects their profitability in terms of agricultural needs. If there's some way to bring people's observations into science in a very real way, such that they are also informing the direction, because like I spent some time growing up on a farm and just recognizing that when you're in the field, you notice the diseases. You notice, oh wait, there are these insects here that shouldn't have been here or weren't here before. And there's so many observations that could, I think, easily inform the way science goes. And I think that also could go in one direction towards providing people a stake in science, because they also have this idea that, like, hey, I can inform based off of my needs and my recognition and what's important, where this goes, such that it can also help me and all of these people around me. Because I think that's one thing where it's like, I think I agree with the idea that having a more artistic representation, or having a representation that is accurate and also interactable, is super important. But also, if I don't ever see that that science, I guess, is reacting to my needs, I think it's a lot more difficult to interact with science. So like what you were saying with agricultural science, like, yeah, that's always interacting with your needs, because you need to know what the most recent things coming up are. But for me, who is, I don't know, working at the Gap or working in a different job that doesn't have this direct interaction with science, how do you incorporate those people as well in terms of like giving people a stake?
I like the comment about farmers. I was just thinking my future father-in-law is a farmer, and he was showing me in the combine as he's harvesting, like it's already collecting so much data that would be useful, down to the like moisture level of the corn as it comes in, and the I don't know, it would be great. I like that idea, right? They obviously know a lot and they're talking to other farmer friends, but if we could connect them to a local university that's can use that data and do research and better inform their methods, is great. And then just on the social capital thing, this is great. Yeah, how can we kind of socialize, sorry, not socialize like socialism, but make social the some of these methods, right? Is there is it putting a bumper sticker that says, I fold at home, that they can lead to conversation? Is it, is it an exercise class where they're all, everybody is bio tracking, some of their heart data as they're exercising? What types of social networks in a non-computer sense as well, can we make around this data collection or data analysis? I don't know. I'm rambling, but
I think this is great. It's great. It's tied to what Ellie was talking about too. Like the to use an overused word, is like giving people agency and letting them see see that what they do changes things, or that they have the ability to change things if they want. And that's similar to a social interaction. Like if you're having a conversation with someone and they're just not there, that's not a fun social interaction. So how do we make a fun, engaging social interaction between a general public of X, Y, and Z archetype and the science that is most relatable to them, is a really good question. And at the same time, how do we make sure that they feel appreciated and feel like their input actually makes a difference? Because a lot of the issue I might have with SciComms is, well, I agree with Eric, it's incredibly important, but a lot of it is A, talking to B, and none of B having a reciprocal relationship with A. So those are two very big challenges. And I think the distributed ledger technology and stuff like what DeSci Labs is building is going to help, because again, it just opens up the field to participation. So if you have a web of trust system, for example, where I trust my cousin who goes to this community college, and my cousin trusts this professor at Harvard, well, if I can see immediately who trusts who, and then I see that trusted professor out of Harvard published paper, I might trust that professor. So there's sort of a social connection there. And then if I then decide that I don't trust that professor at Harvard, I can give feedback back into the system, probably in a weighted way, that other people will see that, oh, this person that goes to a community college trusts this professor, but this other person doesn't trust the professor. So I get to decide whether or not I trust that professor. So there's both that social interaction and that ability to feedback into the system that everyone should be have access to. But that's still a digital solution. The question of physical solutions are, I think, much more intense.
The one important thing here actually is trust, especially if you think that people usually trust their family because they are most of the time surrounded by their family. They listen to them all the time, and they're more likely to actually listen to someone close to them who is not from a scientific background than someone who is from a scientific background but is not close to them, who they do not relate to. This is actually important to know, because one thing that should be done is build trust from an early age. Kids, they love playing video games, they love playing interactive games. One thing that should maybe be considered is how can we introduce science to kids from a very young age? Because when you introduce science to kids, usually their parents will also, in a way, interact with the games that the kids use. I think that's very important, actually, to introduce science to kids in order to build trust for kids, for their parents, grandparents, and actually the entire family.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful too. I think there are dangers with that sort of introduction to a system, but I think the benefits greatly outweigh it. Some of the dangers are like what I don't know if this is happening in the rest of the world, but in the US we have this thing called critical race theory, and the pushback to it is so extreme because they basically are taking what you're describing and applying it to race theory, social structures based on race and religion, all that stuff. And the pushback has been wild. But the idea is if we introduce these concepts to children and get them engaged, the discussion will spread out beyond just the kid. So doing that with science is something that would be wonderful. Another danger is the disillusionment. So like I loved politics as a kid, and then I grew up and I realized that most politicians are very corrupt. So that disillusionment was very, very powerful, more powerful even than the introduction as a child to that system. So there's a lot to unpack with introducing science to children. At the same time, I was introduced to science as a kid, and I love it through and through. So it's a lot.
I think part of it is introducing science in the right ways, making
Yeah.
sure that kids who come in understand that it is not foolproof, that it is the process of distilling knowledge takes time, and that there are always going to be variables that you didn't or couldn't account for, that you will eventually have to probably do the study over, that replication is important, and that if there are mistakes, the larger system is built on itself to continue improving. So making sure that as we're introducing kids to science, we're introducing science in a way that allows for the true flexibility in the process to come through is also important to try and move away from some of this disillusionment. That being said, let's also work to solve the replication crisis so that this kind of disillusionment doesn't become inherent in kids who are coming in, so that they don't constantly see headlines about 90% of cancer studies don't replicate. We wasted billions of dollars in Alzheimer's money. I think that is a huge and important part which DeSci Nodes can help with. That's something I personally am very excited about.
Yeah, I would love to see the headline where it's like prominent researcher says they were wrong, but they're still excited to continue exploring something instead of waiting for it like 20 years for it to be proven wrong by someone else.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have about 2 minutes left in this call. So I want to open up the floor to anyone else who has one last thought. Anyone besides myself and John? Alrighty. Well, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's community call. We will be starting the coffee house in about 60 seconds. Just stay in the same channel. Really and truly, it just transition into us talking about John's dogs for 15 to 20 minutes. Um, yeah, thank you to
Okay.
everyone for joining. We will have a product support call for any alpha testers tomorrow. The onboarding office hours is on Wednesday, and then we will have our very first journal club on Friday. Plenty of exciting updates for the community call next week. We'll either be talking about Ian Hayes' node on the general index or on some of the work that's being done around decentralized citation graphs on chain and some of the technical considerations behind that. Both awesome topics. And as always, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, please feel free to put them in the Discord.